So welcome again for the law session. As I just said, our panel is Dana Rudigkeit from the German Agency of Environment, Romy Klimke, the adjunct professor at the University of Dresden in Germany, and Sada from ADA on doing environmental lawyer. My name is Christian Tietke. I'm an international economic lawyer, and I will give you a short introductory presentation on climate finance, which of course is the key issue at this COP. As we learned and as we discussed, innovation, our topic, requires trust, requires confidence, requires infrastructure and other things as well, but it requires also money, to put it easily. We cannot decouple innovation in a social sense, a just transition in a technology sense, innovation from financing that. That is key here at the COP. And as I don't know whether everybody is very much familiar with the legal background for what is discussed. Has been discussed, is discussed, will probably very heatedly discussed next week here in Baku. I will give you a very short introduction on certain aspects in this regard, just as a framework so that you can more closely actually follow what is going on. As we all know, this COP is not under two shiny foresights, namely with regard to the failed summit COP of the Convention on Biodiversity just 2 weeks ago, where finance was also a big issue, and that failed more or less the conference in Colombia. What is an issue here currently is, of course, first of all, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we have commitments for all parties to undertake certain efforts, also with regard to climate finance. And this was with regard to the developed countries, the industrialized countries, made more specific in a decision by COP15 in Copenhagen, where the developed countries pledged $100 billion a year for climate finance. Paris Agreement took this up, as you might know. However, all this is, as we know, by further decisions will be terminated. This pledge and the promise to finance by the end of this year, and for 2025, we need a new so-called collective quantified goal, which is the discussion currently. And the main challenge in this regard are twofold. First of all, it was tough enough to reach the current goal. Only in 2022, roughly, was the 100 billion goal per year on global finance reached. This is the goal, by the way, that is reached by both public and private money, even though it's quite unclear how to count the private money that is involved. But anyway, so you see there has been a long period of time where we had problems actually bringing up this money. The estimates for what is needed for the future period, at least until 2030, is that we need more than 6 times more than was currently calculated. And that leads to something, whatever, of 6 trillion on 600 billion a year. A lot of people say even more. I leave it there. This, and the main point, and that's what I wanted to touch upon, is, among others, we have a lot of challenges in this regard. The main point for us today is who should contribute. And that is a discussion largely between countries like China and others on the one side, and the European Union, United States, and others on the other side. The basis for the discussion is common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which is laid down already in the Framework Convention, but also in the Paris Convention. This essentially means that we have a differentiated picture of obligations, so to speak, more or less a strict division between, on the one side, the developing countries and on the other side, the developing countries. The problem in this regard is, and I will come back to that in a second, that in international law, in international environmental law, but also in international economic law, we have more or less only the separation between developed and developing countries. We also have least developed countries. I leave that aside for the moment. But nothing more. We cannot legally, we cannot differentiate any further, and that leads to certain problems. Before coming back to that, I'd like to point out that we have more concrete legal text, so to speak, by a current advisory opinion by the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea from May this year, where the tribunal clearly, we don't have to read all the text here, indicated that there is an international legal obligation for financial, among others, financial assistance. I think that's very important also for the negotiations here. We cannot hide away, disregarding errors and so on, we cannot hide away for this. Financial assistance, however, but also within the financial capabilities of developing states. So there is language already, if you see the underlying sentences here of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, indicating, in my interpretation, that it's not only the developed countries that need to contribute, but also other countries. The problem again is, however, how to do that if we have only two worlds, the world of the developed countries and the world of the developing countries. That is the main problem. China, for example, is a developing country, this regard as other countries that have witnessed quite an impressive economic growth in the last 20 years, are also developing countries. We discussed this under the heading of graduation. We need a more closer look at the different stage of development in order to have a more differentiated picture on all of this. There is, and Romy Klimke has written on that, we do have an interesting example in international economic law, without going into detail, recently, where additional language was used in order to maybe cope with this problem of how to differentiate within the world of the developing countries. And that is a language of appropriate and effective, in order to hint at that there is more than, again, this two worlds of developed and developing countries. This is under legal development under the World Trade Organization and the Agreement of Fisheries Subsidies, where we have a similar, in a different setting, but a similar discount. That's my first point. So I think there's language which indicates that we can go further than just have these two words, but that then is, of course, subject also to political negotiations. A final, very quick point is on what has been discussed already. So it's a bit of history, and at least history that is 1 week old. Here, not a week, only a few days, here in Baku. And that is, you might have followed that, the question of what should be on the agenda for the negotiations here, this week and next week. And there were countries that proposed that also so-called unilateral trade measures should be on the agenda. The problem behind that is we have, on the one side, the positive obligations on financial contributions, which I talked about. But on the other side, we of course have, with regard to governments, governmental actions that might be preventing actually or harming our efforts to combat climate change. And they are trade measures. There are certain measures, for example, by the European Union, that are criticized in this regard, also by other developed countries. China and other countries wanted to discuss this and wanted to have that on the agenda for Baku. We hear this on next week. They failed to get it on the agenda, and I think that is not good. We should discuss why, because we have specific language in this regard. If I say specific, I'm a lawyer, I know how to interpret rules, but it's of course not very specific, and that is Article 3, Paragraph 5 of the Framework Convention. If you look at the second sentence in this regard, measures taken to combat climate change, including unilateral ones, should not constitute the means of arbitrary or unjustified discrimination or disguised restriction to international trade. That essentially means whatever we do, also on a unilateral basis, in order to combat climate change, for example, trade measures, they should not harm the international economic system, and it means the other way around. We should only use measures, trade measures, that on the other side do not harm our efforts to combat climate change. That's at least a possible interpretation. Anything that is done should be in accordance with international trade law. And behind that, of course, are unilateral measures, namely of the European Union, namely the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that is highly discussed currently, but also maybe other measures, just recently anti-subsidies measures by the European Union on electronic vehicles from China, which in my opinion are also harming our efforts to combat climate change. So there's a wide area of discussion. I cannot go into detail, but you see and hopefully now understand what the discussions we had on Monday are about and what the discussions next week, namely on climate finance, ready now, but probably most intensively next week, are about. Thank you for your attention. We shall continue, and this is the way I have it on the agenda with Anna Rudig. Is that okay? And that's the way the slides are organized. So
We can be flexible, but
we can do it the other way around. Okay, then I just skip this for a second and go to, whoops, no problem. We start with Romy Klimke, I'm sorry, who is, as I said, from Princeton University, and she will talk about human rights and climate geoengineering.
thank you very much for the kind introduction, the invitation. So I'm in my brief talk, because we don't have a lot of time left here in Baku, in our small conference on sustainable and just transition. I'm trying to give you a
Oops.
Thank you very much. I will try again on the kind invitation introduction. So in the time that we have left here in our dinner conference, I'm trying to give you a small glimpse of the current research of mine, dealing with the relationship of human rights and climate geoengineering, which is very specific. There's lots to talk about. So I'm really trying to give you a brief overview of a very complex and increasingly heatedly debated subject. So first of all, to describe the broader frame of this discussion, we have to think about first how there's a nexus in general human rights and so interestingly, nowadays we are quite aware, and human rights have already been underpinning the recent discussions we have had in previous panels as well. The human rights, international climate law, or human rights and international climate change are extremely linked. So much is clear, but interestingly, international public law wasn't for rather not entirely. International climate law, human rights law were basically treated as separate areas, and only in 2015, Paris Agreement was it recognized for the first time in the preamble of the Paris Agreement that human rights are directly or indirectly implicated by the consequences of climatic change. And so nowadays, and especially also due to the increase in climate litigation, so very successful at times court cases around the world. We know that states have human rights obligations to adopt mitigating and adaptating measures. So much is clear. What we don't know for sure at this point is in how far these obligations also entail measures that use climate engineering technologies, and in how far these climate engineering technologies might even violate human rights at certain times. So, what is geoengineering? I'm trying to give you a quick overview of this term because we talk more and more about geoengineering, but oftentimes we use this term describing different things. So, this is the definition that I refer to based on a report by the IPCC published in 2014, where the IPCC stated that its broad set of methods and technologies operating on large scale that aim to deliberately alter the climate system in order to alleviate the impacts of climate change. So what's important here is these technologies died on a large scale and in a deliberate manner. And then to categorize geoengineering technologies, we could say that it's an umbrella term for, on the one hand, carbon dioxide renewable methods and technologies, which Dana Rudichka will address a little bit further, and on the other hand, solar radiation modification technologies. Because I don't have the time to read these technologies, this is just a brief overview of, on the one hand, what carbon dioxide removal methods encompass. So a broader definition of carbon dioxide removal methods would also encompass nature-based methods. This is what we talk about, we refer to afforestation, reforestation, and rewetting peatlands, and so on and so forth. But closer focus would discuss methods that are called hybrid methods because they use actual natural processes, but they accelerate and scale up these natural processes by adding certain substances to the mix, like enhanced weathering or ocean fertilization, and then also purely technological methods such as direct air capture and storage and bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And again, Dana Rudichka explained a little bit more about these technologies. And on the other hand, we have solar radiation modification, which, first of all, differs in general from carbon dioxide removal because it's really not about getting carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, but it's really only about restricting the sun rays, basically, that enter the atmosphere or that hit the surface of our planet. So, not about not about lowering emissions, not about getting carbon out of the atmosphere, but really only treating the symptoms of climate change. And the regional approaches that are being encompassed by this umbrella for instance, and marine cloud brightening, the modification of surface observations, for instance, paint streets at roofs of houses white, or change the genetics of plants to make them lighter. But there is some science methods that they use out installing some giant mirrors in space to belong with satellite years. And one more technology that is implicitly being discussed and which is also in indications capacity so cheap is the injection of reflected aerosols into the stratosphere. In this case, sulfur, chemicals like chemical substances are based on sulfur are injected into the stratosphere to make the atmosphere charger. This is comparable to like an explosion, basically, but also comes with a lot of risks. Anyway, what is also interesting, especially about injecting aerosols in the stratosphere, I mentioned that it's so cheap that some scholars have concluded it's actually only a matter of time until these technologies are being deployed, because they're cheap, they're easy to implement, and this would happen even in a unilateral manner. This is especially dangerous if we think about these risks we're going to look at on the next slide. But just to give you an example of how geoengineering is, as the slide says, not so hypothetical anymore. This is not happening on a large scale yet. There are a lot of research projects taking place throughout the world, especially in North America, Europe, and Asia. So we can see this is happening. There's lots of research already taking place, but it also comes with a lot of risks. So once again, I'm not going to talk about too much carbon dioxide removal technologies, but especially solar radiation modification has already also been examined in a very critical way and manner, because it comes with specific risks that tell us how unpredictable the implementation of solar radiation modification technologies could be. So especially, for instance, thinking about injecting sulfur in the atmosphere could lead to harms to the ozone layer, and making the atmosphere darker would lead to reduced photosynthesis and the greatest risk. So the worst case scenario, so to speak, would be the so-called termination shock, which would basically mean that solar radiation modification technologies that have been employed for a while and yet for the actual decrease in atmospheric temperatures are terminated from one day to another. For instance, as a result to achieve net zero with intentions or perhaps a global pandemic. And this would lead to a sudden increase in global temperatures in such a short amount of time that the human rights consequences would be catastrophic. And just in general, to point to two more risks that these climate geoengineering technologies entail, and there's the so-called moral hazard risk, which is, I think, for human rights is especially important, but it means that the more we concentrate on certain geoengineering technologies, and we think, or we get convinced that there's certain silver technofix that we can use to make all these climate change worries go away, and that this distracts us from the actual primary goals of emission capital adaptation efforts. And secondly, and I think the previous slide already demonstrated that or illustrated that quite well, is the slippery slope assumption. Once we start doing research in an organized and large scale manner, to lead to deployment, because research has to be practical, and why not? If we've already done the research, why not keep involved? So, and now I'm getting to the actual human rights perspective. So this slide basically shows you a selection of human rights that will be implicated by the risks and implications of geoengineering technologies. And this is not all, but I really tried to assemble most important ones, and I tried to categorize them according to according to their original categories of behaviors under the human rights law, like civil and individual rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, and so on and so on. But the important thing here is that human rights in general are all interdependent and indivisible, which means that for the enjoyment of human rights, or of a set of human rights, other human rights are to be guaranteed as well. And this applies especially for geoengineering technology. So if geoengineering technologies have implications for a certain set of human rights, other human rights will be implicated as well. And just to give you a few examples, here we might look at this example of the termination shock. So if we really decide to deploy solar radiation modification technologies on a large scale, and then we have the sudden termination of these technologies, and this would wreak havoc basically across the rights to food and water, the right to have a life, and basically lots of other user rights. But we could also think about the injection of sulfur into the atmosphere. As I said, this forms the ozone layer. And once the ozone layer is formed, this might lead to an increase in skin cancer and other medical conditions. But even though CDR technologies are usually less risky than solar radiation modification technologies, they also bring lots of risks with them. For instance, conflicts in the landfills. So landfill changes could affect land, but they could also affect the right to food and water. And actually, well, many other examples that we could discuss here. But in the remaining time, I would really try to bring one message across, which is basically that human rights, if they're infringed upon, this doesn't necessarily mean that they are violated. So we do not always have violation of human rights, but infringement of human rights is often justified. But this means that we have to balance the negative impacts on certain human rights with other benefits for human rights or the public interest. So we can stand or we can enter into a balance test, but to do this, you need to have all the data. You need to have all the information, what kind of implications it impacts certain technologies in class. And this doesn't only apply to geoengineering technologies, but to any kind of new technology. And now this is where, in legal terms, the so-called precautionary principle comes into play. This originally comes from international environmental law, but also is often in the human rights law, which means that if we are not wholly sure about the impacts and the risks of a certain technology or method, and this action that we want to realize is well, still risky in this way, and we should not deploy it at all. So as long as there are remaining risks, and this is especially true for solar radiation modification, but on a lesser scale also with regards to some dioxide removal, and we should not deploy these technologies. So to leave you with some preliminary conclusions at this point, because this is really a very young topic also for human rights lawyers. At this point, what is necessary is more research which is consistent with the precautionary principle and with human rights. Because first of all, before we add new harms to and human rights, we have to focus on the measures that we know that work, which is mitigating emissions and scale up our adaptation efforts as much as we can. And if we decide to deploy geoengineering technologies at all, this should only happen in a minimal manner, namely with regard to residual emissions. So this is also something where we should talk about what are the kind of emissions that absolutely cannot cut, that we depend on. These are residual emissions, only then to be employed geoengineering technologies. Okay, and I will leave it at that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, so hello, I'm Lana Ochta from German Environment Agency, and my perspective is not so much academic, it's more since I'm involved as a research and policy advisor in political processes. It's more a practical perspective. And yeah, my topic is CDR, carbon dioxide removal, as Romy and others have already mentioned. But before I will start to talk about CDR, I have to remind you that this is just one mitigation option to have, and there are others. Here's a chart from IPCC AR 5 or 6. I think it's communicated, maybe it's 5. No, it's SPN from AR6. And it shows that renewable energies like solar and wind are much cheaper and affordable than CDR and CCS. Well, there is not enough time to differentiate now between CCS and CDR, but problems are roughly that. Yes. So this is just a quick reminder before I start now to talk about CDR. Well, for those who are not that familiar with CDR, since I'm a public law expert, I will explain technical details here just to give an imagination to those who are not so familiar with CDR. There's the idea of direct air capture and storage, which could be compared to artificial trees. So chemicals are used to take carbon from the air and to put it somewhere, so cleaning out the air, so to say. There is bioenergy, so plants are stored in the end, so carbon again is put away. There's the idea of ocean fertilization, carbon farming, enhanced weathering, we heard already. So all these technologies, when carbon is taken from the air, are built in the air. And as Romy has mentioned, there are many trade-offs, risks, human rights, consumption of resources, many techniques to meet energies and themselves, or they do need land, and so there might be land use changes and food production might be affected. There is carbon farming, eutrophication problems, biodiversity loss, and pollution water with bodies used to use it. Slides. One of the first principles, these are risks that, in theory, can be managed. But there's another risk, which is something forgotten. It's the positive wording is climate effectiveness, or is the risk for climate policy itself. It's versus the permanent removals. CDR carbon that is stored in geological formations, it can, of course, there can be leakages. So there has to be monitoring. And yeah, to ensure monitoring for 400 years, even the EU CCS regulation doesn't ensure this. And in principle, it's technically, my experts in my institution, it's technically impossible to monitor. You can't really detect where it doesn't come out the hole you put it in. So there is a probable permanence on indirect emissions because energy is used. So in the end, the climate effect may be zero in reality, but not on paper. And of course, offsetting prices there might be a mismatch. So offsetting real emissions might be more attractive for companies than to reduce emissions. And one word is more hazard, but in literature it's also mitigation deterrence, a term University of Lancaster primarily used and made this brand name, mitigation deterrence. And of course, there is a little problem that there are cases where a project that is existing on paper doesn't exist in reality. And to give you some illustration of this, where this was about, not about carbon, which would be used during oil mining, so to say, but problems are very similar. And those projects should have been in China, but indeed they didn't exist. But German law, but my institution has to check this certificates. And what should my colleagues do? They just can look on the paper. They are not allowed to travel to China. It's a German authority. They can't just say in China, hello, here we are. We have to check if everything is all right here in China. So this has been private certificates. And yeah, there has been much criminal energy. Witness protection programs are now going on. People disappeared And of course, in my institution, my boss, Dirk Messner, had to go to parliamentary investigations. Well, I just want to illustrate that there is much money in this market, that we really do need robust rules to manage all these trade-offs, and also for monitoring and verification. Monitoring and verification, this is also the technical word used, but is it really real? What's on the paper? So verification. Yeah, so we needed robust rules. I want to touch now what rules are relevant. And if you think about rules, we first should start to think about carbon markets, because all those technologies, where they do cost something. So why should anybody do this without getting money? So it's a topic of carbon markets. And I want to start, no, they're not employees. In principle, basically, that's the main idea many people and policymakers had in their mind. There is, on the one hand, voluntary market, and on the other hand, there is public state-governed market, which is the EU emission trading scheme. So in principle, there is, maybe I was inspired by Green Zone and Blue Zone. So green is private, blue is state. So there is in principle this idea, and it works in the last decade. There haven't been many interferences. But we already have in the EU the Renewable Energy Directive. Well, if we have enough time, I could explain why it's relevant for CDR, but there is biomass imported into the EU that is certified as being sustainable. And this biomass is used for energy production. And by the way, burning imported wood means that you don't burn anything, and legally there is a zero emission. But this is another problem. And this EU directive incorporates ISO standards and private standards, not only for verifying, but also for material rules. And well, there are some problems, but so far, it's not the same scandal so far, like in the same failure coverage I already showed you. But it's a matter of time that does also happen. And of course, there are initiatives that biomass wood imported from Brazil is in principle always sustainable. So this would happen. And while there are, regarding carbon, it's not only ISO, there are so many private standards, all standard. There are GHG Protocol, hundreds. I don't know all of them. But basically they are all quite similar, but they are in competition to each other. And well, to deal with all those trade-offs mentioned and the risks that have to be managed when we are looking at those standards, and they do cover CDR and not only GHG emissions. The tool they use is more a management tool. They just address that there might be a problem, or you should address that there is a problem, and that you should make a plan to minimize this problem. So there is no real criteria, no threshold, nothing. In all those standards, please tell me if you know better standards. I don't know so far. And in the EU, we do have now the EU Carbon Removal Certification Framework, which is, the carbon credits within the EU of the future. And well, they mention sustainability, but they just mention it. And now at the moment, they are finalizing and negotiating the delegated acts. And there have been hopes that there will be sustainability criteria. I didn't see them so far. And in the end, this framework is just incorporating private standards. And then a very important term there is interoperability. It's just a thin layer, an umbrella taking in private standards. And well, state thinks, oh, private standards are fine. And when we were talking about private standards, they think, oh, the state will do. So yeah, who has the responsibility to ensure sustainability? And yeah, so far there's some distribution of the tape. And here in Paris, in Baku, in the last days, we finalized Article 6.4 with Article 6 Paris Agreement is big international framework carbon credits. And the last, since 2015, this framework was finalized. Now it is. And now CDR is also included. Well, to make it short, there are the links on the slides. There is a sustainable development tool for CDR, but when you read it, it's management language. And they mention national environmental law. However, it's said, well, if you infringe national environmental laws, we're expected to respond appropriately. So, yeah, what does this mean? So, if you can't infringe national laws, so there are many problems, and well, the argumentation. Why? Well, many politicians now say it's a success that we have concluded up to 6. But why is it now finalized? Because states weren't asked no, and the argumentation was, it's just a standard that already exists. So we do not need state approval. And then they are arguing, oh, if states don't agree, then they can make a new decision. So they reverse the consensus principle, kind of. So private standards are now kind of public international law regarding the carbon markets. Well, I have been quite critical, so 2 minutes for how what are options for improvement. Well, first we could talk about national approaches. Well, it's a goal mark in the end. And in theory, multilateral agreements would be a very good idea. Yeah, climate club would be an address, but at the moment, it's not the best time for multinationalism. So it's and one option I want to mention, and it's kind of my favorite option, is improving ISO. ISO is not just a private standard, as it is often said. It's actually a mixture of private and public institutions. States are mandating many options. The German government has contracted the German body of ISO, and in the WTO law refers to ISO, and even the new trade agreements, they are much more positive regarding ISO. So ISO is mandated by states, and ISO standards are to some extent recognized by states and by WTO. It's also in the TBT agreement. We don't have time, but to improve ISO would mean to improve inclusiveness. I had been in ISO processes, and there is no environmental, and it's just industry talking to itself, and the German government and the EU government is financing NGOs to take the part in this ISO processes. And one option would be to integrate the obligation that those standardizing processes have to be more inclusive. TBT differences are not sufficient. The states have to finance NGOs and to ensure inclusiveness much more. So that these standards can improve. And of course, we need more substantial materials. This is a message to all the national scientists who know more about those techniques and their technologies. We need real criteria. We need thresholds. I can't just invent how many chemicals or whatever is allowed or not. And this is, of course, But there are many papers on those things, but they are always the bird's view, and they are looking at hundreds and thousands of cases, but this is nothing that can be operationalized when we want to decide, is this project, is it white or black? And yeah, so in the end, we need a transdisciplinary work on those standards and substantial criteria. And yeah, that's an input from my side. And yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Please, beautiful.
I can.
Yes.
Thank you for your invitation. My name is Selina Mekileva. I'm delivering lecture one client who's an AD University of Malta. Also, I'm a faculty lawyer. So I'm going to deliver a very brief speech on the Azerbaijan Continental as a critical mineral supplier for Europe and globally, and how uh, mineral waste and electronic waste be used for the sport system in Azerbaijan. So first of all, I have to mention that Azerbaijan is only accountable for 0.1 percentage of the carbon emissions globally, but we are heavily suffering climate change. So for us as a state, as a country, adaptation measures are very important, but we are also interested in very effective mitigation measures in the world, because without mitigation, we will suffer more. So my colleagues and many environment lawyers, we were thinking that is it possible that Azerbaijan may play a realm of new potential source of critical minerals? So I'm going to share with you some very important points, is it possible or not, and some very huge challenges that we are facing. First of all, I got to confess to Azerbaijan, I didn't pay a lot of attention to the mineral sector for last, I would say, for 25 years, because Azerbaijan was really heavily rely on oil and gas income, and we just still rely on this industry. So there were not any strategic documents or any strategic plans to develop some other industries rather than oil and gas. So that's why for us, mining industry and technology used in mining industry, sustainable technologies for mining industry, quite a new topic. We have quite many rich deposits, especially I would underline copper and cobalt, just in the list of the critical minerals. But we have very few players in the national market. We have only one state-owned mining company and only one major foreign investor. And this market is somehow, I would not say empty, not something that looks like empty. Yes, it's just new for us. But we have good resources and reserves, especially in the recently um, the Ahmite zones, mostly in Kabajar, Hemzaklan, Ardan, and Tartal. But the most important part that I think we can use not only natural resources, deposits that we have, we can also use a lot of mineral waste that was kind of collected or located in this area, because it was kind of for last 30 years that Azerbaijan faced illegal exploitation of natural resources that provided previously occupied territories. So all this illegal exploitation of natural resources left there a lot of mineral waste, tailing dams that still contains a lot of valuable minerals like cobalt, like copper, and some sort, maybe silver and gold. So my approach is that Azerbaijan should use, of course, with a partnership with larger countries that would transfer technologies to Azerbaijan, all this mineral waste for extraction of the critical minerals without mining. And another point is that Azerbaijan has also huge electronic waste, but our legislation is not very well developed when it comes to e-waste. So I believe that again in partnership also it was a guidance Azerbaijan made to develop legislation of waste, and we also can recycle electronic waste and obtain for it critical minerals. And as a last result, of course, we have reached deposits, but I would say that Azerbaijan um, have some assumptions about reserves, but we need further exploration, further information, geological data on it. And what are the main challenges that Azerbaijan would face? The first thing that our legislation is not paying a lot of attention to the critical minerals. I would say there isn't just only one legislative act. It's related to the state security. It pays attention to the lithium, niobium, uh, because they are considered as a strategic resources. So cobalt, which we have acquired rich deposits, are not regulated with any legislative act. Also, they are not mentioned in any policy document or strategic plans. They also another issue is that our government pays a lot of attention to the precise metals. So I was talking a lot about with our government officials on this topic instead by saying that maybe we should make a shift on our policy. Uh, the answer was that we are trying as developing country to pay more attention on the minerals that brings income in a quite short period. So unfortunately, currently we have no any even draft strategic document or draft policy document that pays attention to minerals rather than precise ones that maybe will bring not only income to the country but also partnership with the paths in a way of green transition. Because Azerbaijan took a lot of and quite ambitious goals to make a transition from oil gas industry to the clean energy. But how exactly we are going to make this transition from oil gas industry to the clean energy is unclear. So my approach is my opinion that providing a critical minerals to the euro and the countries that need it, and in it as a barter to take some advanced technologies or maybe to facilitate some factories in Azerbaijan that would produce clean technologies for green transition would be best option for Azerbaijan because as a developing country, my understanding that our government is not going to allocate a lot of funding for technology transfer, but we need it. So I believe that this kind of partnership would be a win-win approach. This is just my idea. But another challenge is that we are facing. I think it's the mostly related to the policy and the approach on the government approach of environmental issues. Unfortunately, in Azerbaijan, environment and environmental policy is still considered as a part of industry. So we get it as a legacy for Soviet period because it was approach of Soviet period, Soviet Union. That environment is important, ecology is important, but it's just a part of industry. It's important, just part of industry. So I think that maybe capacity building and maybe um, new persons, new cases in Azerbaijan government that are would at least explain all these ideas to the government or present these ideas within government would be quite helpful. In the and I think I just want to mention that I believe that it was a partnership with developed countries. It was a possible technology transfer from developed countries, not only for clean transition to the clean energy, but also for sustainable mining, because we had also a lot of human rights issues related to the mining in Azerbaijan, and recently we faced several problems on this topic. So maybe if you will get some sustainable technologies from developed countries that Paris Agreement supports. Uh,
by providing sustainable mining, by providing critical minerals for technology, for green technology, and also getting all this technology in a more accessible way, Azerbaijan will be able to make the transition from oil-based energy to clean energy. I understand that topic that I'm presenting here may seem very simple and in some part maybe almost not relevant, but it's very important for Azerbaijan in very impractical terms. So my situation is like, thank you a lot.
Thank you very much. It's not simple at all. It's very complicated and highly topical. Critical raw materials are major issue for the country, for the European Union, for the world. So thank you very much. You have 5 minutes for questions, please. Can you come up? I'm sorry. Chair, makes it easier. So you can make the move. Please. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much to read this question from I just have more question for Jean Jingering because you mentioned very well of the risks. Are there any international law or governance systems that make sure that the deployment of more benefits than the risks? Also, we make sure it's peaceful uses. How, if not, how will develop it? How has growth
Achso, wollt ihr was sagen?
So my answer would be that the first question is, can law ever prevent a state, a rogue state, to do something? Well, but we can try and we can delegitimize. And for example, there is a decision on the CBE moratorium 1033, possibly called the de facto geoengineering moratorium. But the debate whether it's binding and what powers BD has, but there is some kind of law, and it's depending on what technique we are talking about marine ocean fertilization, for example. Also, there is some international law regarding stratospheric aerosol injection. We do have not only the Montreal Protocol about ocean nucleation substances, we have the ozone protection convention, which is also a Vienna Convention. So there is some law. Well, it's not perfect, but there is law. Yeah, and I believe that human rights.
Yeah, so as you can see, there are some fragmented approaches to regulating these emerging geoengineering technologies, but there's also, I think, and we discussed that before, there's also some struggle that we can observe with how we have with a clear stance or agree with that position by Sri Kukamchi. I think, and you indicate that very well with your question. And of course, the hope is that the benefits will outweigh the risks and the negative implications. This is why, especially in human rights law, we do not have a certain clear, explicit prohibition of the deployment of geoengineering technologies. There's another instrument I would like to add with regard to ocean fertilization. There's another amendment that was published on that was agreed upon in 2013, prohibited ocean fertilization, but hasn't entered into force yet. And it's also clear whether it will ever enter into force because we can see shift of states moving towards more favorable geoengineering technologies. So very interesting from a lawyer and a policymaker's point of view.
May I just very quickly add that we, next to what has been said, we do have some methodology, at least, under WTO on the agreement of phytosanitary measures. We had risk assessment methodology, and of course, very important what Dana Udikat said, we rely and should rely to a large extent on international standardization as reference points for what we should and can do. Very good question.
Sie speak a feature of international law that's even international humanitarian law, the so-called NMOD convention, which prohibits using technologies for hostile purposes in order to combat violence. So this because you also mentioned how states could use such weapons. There's something international humanitarian must.
Thank you very much. What your question was with regard to all the answers. Any further questions? Otherwise, unfortunately, most unfortunately, due to time restrictions, I think we have to close. There's another session at 2:00. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the participants. Thank you very much for the participants online. Thank you very much for all the speakers, for the organizers of the 3 panels, for the organizers here at the venue, which worked out very well. And thank you also to Janis Bertling, who you do not know, but he's sitting in Germany and taking care that this is on YouTube. Thank you very much for you. And all of the best and cross fingers for this COP. Thank you very much.